Yo, what up, YouTubers? I'm here with another edition of a Glastonbury Romance. Let's begin. When last we were in Glastonbury, Mr. Decker was being cursed by the powers that be for some reason. It must have been about 6 hours after that talk with Penny Pitches in the potato garden that Sam Decker, troubled at heart by what he considered the gross and inexplicable treachery of his foster mother, sat gloomily by himself on the warm steps of the Abbey House terrace. A little below him, on wooden seats placed side by side, above a low parapet, sat Mrs. Euphemia Drew and her other guests. The more Sam meditated upon that afternoon's excursion to White Lake, the more troubled he became. Would his father detect anything? Would Nell in her agitation as hostess forget her prudence? Had William Zoyland secretly planned the whole affair in order to nip in the bud this perilous growth whose frail seedling shoot he had already discerned? I shall get red, he thought. I shall get red as a turkey cock, just as Penny said. My hand will shake when she gives me the tea. We shan't dare to look at each other or speak to each other. Father's bound to notice something. Had Nell Zoyland seen the lad at this moment and watched the puckering of his freckled forehead in the way as he rose now to offer help to Mary? The muscles of his poor chin contracted. She would have loved him more than ever. Mary's own face, as she carried a silver tray in one hand and a coffee jug in the other, was drawn and white. It was all over as far as Miss Drew was concerned. She knew that already, though the lady had not spoken a word to her on the subject. John had behaved with irrevocable folly at lunch, had talked wildly, had expressed disbelief in the legend of the Holy Thorn, had announced that it was a pity that the Danes had been turned back at Havet Gap, and finally had declared that this discovery of Joseph of Amethia's tomb was the merry mummery of the monks. Yes, it was all over for them with Miss Drew. She would never ask him again. She would never let him meet him again. It would be a lucky thing if she didn't pack him off, then and there, merely for having such a cousin. I'm a little confused there why we're back with John, but let's go forward anyway. I'll review it later. When Mary, with Sam helping her, for both Miss Drew's cook and housemaid, the sisters Rogers, had begun to wash up, joined the rest of the party on the terrace, John had fallen into a more amiable mood. He still remained irresponsive about the Holy Thorn, but he had evidently taken a fancy to Mr. Decker, and he was listening now quite humbly with the vicar narrated to him in a grave and unaffecting tone certain historic facts about the ruins before them. Hic jacet sepultus inslicit rex artuus in insulta Avalonia, recited Matt Decker in a deep, quiet voice. The end of this 12th century it was, he went on, when they found the coffin, a great hollowed-out oak trunk with the bones of the king and queen. I knew I said I was going to look up what that meant, hic jacket, but I forgot. Sorry. Nearly 100 years later, Edward I buried them before the high altar. The books say that Leland, the antiquary, actually saw them as late as the 16th century. Since then, they have been lost to sight. The vicar of Glastonbury sighed as he ceased speaking, and at the same moment a light wind from the west, rustling across the masses of ruined masonry, caught the topmost twigs of tall elms on the right of the tower arch and made them bow before it. When I told my good friend Mr. Evans this morning, began John Crow, that I had been invited here, it did excite him. He quoted what he called a Welsh triad, something about no one knowing where the grave of Arthur was. Miss Euphemia Drew folded her cream-colored cashmere shawl more tightly round her neck, hiding the gold-mounted moonstone brooch that clasped her bodice, and then, turning her chin above the wrinkled fingers she had thus raised to her throat, "Not know where it is?" she said sternly. "Fiddle-dee-dee! We all know where it is. It's under that broken arch." Mary tried to convey to her cousin by a rapid glance that he must accept the verdict of Miss Drew as to the grave of the great king without further question. But the run-down Danish adventurer refused to be stopped. "My friend Mr. Evans quoted a Latin jingle, too. What was it, sir? I expect you know it. It began with hic jacet, just as yours did." Matt Decker smiled sadly. You mean hic jacet Arturus rex quadrum rosque futurus? Is that what he said? King once and king to be, he added, with his clerical instinct for making things clear. Most of our Glastonbury sayings have to do with some sort of hic jacet, he concluded rather wistfully. Wish I knew what it meant. What do you say, sir? Inquired John. That King Arthur is really the most deeply rooted superstition that this place represents? The younger Decker began to feel seriously angry with the East Anglican. It was all very well to display a lack of antiquarian interest, but here, on this terrace, gazing out at Edgar's Chapel, at the great Tower Arch, at St. Mary's Church, at St. Thomas's Chapel, at the rich ruins of the most sacred Ecclesia Vestula in all Britain, to definitely challenge the whole genius loci seemed to Sam's simple mind as much as a lapse from nature's ways as it would have been to allow a minnow to perish for lack of fresh water. But the elder Decker seemed totally unconscious of the insult to the spot he loved. Well, of course, to our old-fashioned Protestant ancestors, Glastonbury must have reeked with what you call superstition. 3 famous Saxon kings are buried here. Something like 6 well-known saints are buried here. All the Holy Grail legends gathered to a head here. The Druids play a great part here, and long before the Druids there was a lake village. He gave a grave, characteristically West County jerk with his head to indicate the northwestern point of the compass, whose mounds you can still see in the fields. Ancient British, that probably was. Older anyway than history. But I expect the deeper-rooted superstition here, if you could compel Glastonbury Tor to speak, would turn out to be the religion of the people who lived before the ancient Britons, even before the Neolithic men. At any rate, we have some excuse for being superstitious in these parts. Don't you think so, Miss Drew? I think you are very kind, dear Vicar, to answer Mr. Crow's questions at all, said the old lady severely. For myself, I would answer it rather differently. I would assure him that what he called superstitions we call the only true faith. This remark produced a complete silence. My friend Mr. Evans, it was John who broke the spell, says that it's neither King Arthur nor Joseph of Arimathea that's the real hidden force still active in Glastonbury. What does he say it is? Inquired Mary, hoping against hope that John would, even now, redeem himself. He won't say. He's got reserves and touchy. It's my own opinion that it has to do with Merlin. But I expect I'm all wrong. When I mentioned Merlin, all he did was to quote a lot of Welsh riots in Welsh. He's a queer character, my friend Evans, but he interests me very much. Will you take some more coffee or some brandy, Vicar? Interrupted Miss Drew in a tone that seemed to say, when once I have exposed the unpleasantness of a rude young man, there is no need for him to make further efforts to reinstate himself in my favor. And then, when the vicar had shaken his head, carry the trays away, child, please, and tell Lily and Rogers that you and I will get our own tea today. Oh, so much tea talk. The cook's name was Louis Rogers. She was only a year older than Lily, and as a rule, Miss Drew called her Louis. But when upset by the spectacle of the world's disorder, she always called her Rogers. It had been her mother's, as well as her grandmother's, custom to call their cooks by their surnames, and Miss Drew reverted to it as a sort of invocation of these thin-lipped, tenderly stern women whose miniatures were on her writing table. The mere utterances of the word Rogers seemed to Miss Drew to bring back decency and respect to human intercourse. John had not the courage nor the wit to rise from his chair and help his cousin carrying her tray into the house. So it worked out that Sam Decker once more was her companion. But Sam never addressed a single word to her as he walked by her side. His sole thought was his growing dread of the afternoon's encounter. Mary herself pondered bitterly upon the interior meaning of Miss Drew's little speech about their tea. It meant a kind of emotional unbending and intimacy, a crisis in sympathetic confidence. But it also meant that under no conceivable circumstances would her employer allow her to go on meeting her cousin. Ladies who live together possess these indirect ways of communicating with each other, and by the tone in which Mary replied, "Yes, dear, that will be so nice," Miss Drew knew that while there would be nothing in the nature of the scene between them, the separation of Mary from John would take more than one evening's dignified protest. Meanwhile, the sun began slanting its rays more and more warmly and mistily upon the group on the terrace. The smooth expanse of grass which separated them from the ruins bore on its surface now a few dark, fluctuating shadows as the light wind stirred the elm tree tops. The three hills of the place, Whirl Hill, Chalice Hill, and the Tor, were all behind them, and beyond the ruins and beyond the trees and beyond the vaporous roofs of the town stretched the wide, low valley where flowed the river Brue, and where the bridge Perilous was, into which, as Decker was now telling him, Arthur had thrown his sword. Dim and rich and vague the valley stretched, covered with an undulating veil of blue-purple mist. Orchard upon orchard, pasture upon pasture, it sank away, the lowest pastoral country in the land of England, lower than the level of the sea, heavy with its precious relics as the sea bottom with its drowned ships. As he gazed at all this, feeling more and more friendly to Mr. Decker and more hostile to Miss Drew, John began to say to himself that it was nothing else than the very low-lying character of the country they made it such a fatal receptacle for the superstitious of 2,000 years. Into this blow-purple vapor, into the bosom of these fields lower than the sea, floated, drifted upon the wind, all those dangerous, unnerving myths that had taken the heart out of a man's courage and self-reliance upon the earth. The true faith indeed. While the land reeked with the honey lotus of all the superstitions of the world. Here they had come, here they had taken refuge, driven into flight by the great dragon-beaked ships and the long bright spears of his own heathen ancestry. And here, caught by these fatal low-lying flats, they had lingered and clung till they grew rotten and miasmic, full of insidious mind-drugging poison. God, this place must be charged, thick and slab, with all the sweet, stickly religious lies that had ever medicined the world. Here lie green scum over their old stagnant watercourses. Here lie green pond-weeds upon cattle moats, these tender false mandragoras, lulled to sleep the minds of the generations. No wonder Philip, with his accursed machines, found no manhood to resist his despotism in a place like this. Wow. Pretty harsh words there. It was at this point, to John Crow's contemplations, that Mary and Sam came quickly back and repeated themselves by his side. Receded. They'd exchanged only 2 sentences on the way back from the house. Mary had asked him whether they could spare Mr. Weatherwax, who worked in both the gardens, for the whole day tomorrow, and Sam had replied that he thought they could, as long as the old man helped Penny to pump before he came across the road. John was soon made aware of the miserable depression into which Mary had fallen. Her profile troubled him by its tragic tenseness. He rose abruptly. "Goodbye, Miss Drew," he said, bowing to her from where he stood. "Thank you so much for having asked me here. Goodbye, sir. I hope you'll let me see you again. Cousin Mary, will you show me the short cut to Whirl Hill?" He swept her off with him so boldly and decisively, actually taking her by the arm, that Miss Drew was nonplussed. "Don't desert me, Mary," was all she could cry out after them. They skirted the kitchen garden and reached a little gate in a building pivot hedge, where old Weatherwax, in some wanton mood, had planted hyacinths. Hyacinths? There was a clump of these heavily fragrant flowers by the gate, and a lark high up above them was quivering in the hot sky. Mary put her hand at the latch after giving him minute directions of the way. They could see the whole ridge of Whirl Hill in the distance, and the girl knew she ought to leave him at once and return, but it was hard to do so. Mr. Evans was expecting him, he explained, by a lonely tree up there. And as he searched with his eyes the ridge she showed him, he could see clearly a particular tree which stood out in clear relief. He declared he could even see the Welshman's figure propped on the ground against this tree. But the girl contradicted this. "I know that black thing up there well," she said. "I used to take it for a person. It's an old post. I went up there once to make sure." "What tree is that?" Evans said it was a thorn, but it doesn't look like a thorn to me. "It's a sycamore," she answered. "At least I think so." "Oh, I don't care what it is." Her voice trembled. Her lips were curving. "What is it, my treasure?" "What is it?" Her tears were swallowed in a sudden gust of anger. She dropped the latch of the little gate, and her whole body stiffened. You know what you've done, I suppose, John, by your silly talk? You've spoiled everything. She'll never ask you again. She'll stop by seeing you again. My seeing you again. Oh, how could you do it, you fool? How could you do it? Yeah, we'll stop for there. So I was a little confused at the beginning there because kind of just jumped right into back into John. Somehow he made it. And last week he was like, oh yeah, he was getting a ride. So I guess he got, and it kind of it began. What do you call it? In res. I can't think of the word right now. In media res, in the middle of the action. So, which is uncommon for this book, which is so fucking long that they would skip over like an important scene where he actually arrives, but it began in the middle of the scene. And we lost Sam Decker as our protagonist for a little bit, and are back with fucking John Crow, who I kind of dislike. He's just such a jackass, you know. Who the fuck does he think he is, you know? So that was a little confusing for me. I'm going to look up that word before we go. Hick jacket. Hick jasset. Let's look it up. Hick jasset. This is exciting, huh? It's a musical group. It's an epithet that means an epitaph. That's all it means, I guess. Here lies. Okay, I mean that's kind of what I figured in that. So it just means here lies, like would be on a grave. All right. So that's it for today. I'll see you again. Peace. Cheers.